All right, so we're going to try and do a quick rundown of Section 5 notes here. I'm going to try and move pretty quickly, so just pause if you need to fill in a blank. Your objectives are to describe the specialization of multicellular organisms and to identify different types of stem cells. But the section starts out by talking about the organization within an organism, right? So you have cells, tissues, organs, organ systems. So you need some definitions for those things. You know what a cell is, the most basic unit of life, but tissues are groups of cells that work together to perform a similar function. Organs are groups of tissues that work together, right? And then work your way on up to organ systems, group of organs that work together, right? So just for an example, you could have a nerve cell that is part of a tissue, a bunch of nerves that are communicating back and forth. Those tissues are going to be part of an organ, like say your brain or your spinal column, right? But you have these systems, all these different organs working together. So you have everything from your brain to your spinal column to a nerve ending that's in the tip of your finger that helps you feel the world around you, right? There you have lots of different organ systems, whether it's your nervous system that I just talked about, or your digestive system, or your muscular system, right? There's lots of different systems. So just quick rundown of that, but that should kind of be review. That'd be more like what you talk about in your health classes, right? But otherwise, this is the hard thing to answer, right? I'm supposed to understand that all of these cells, all those different systems that I just talked about, have different kinds of cells, but all of those cells have the exact same DNA. And we want to talk about and understand how cells perform different functions when they all have the same set of directions. So the answer is not simple. It's kind of complicated. But start out by understanding that cells are differentiated. They are specialized. They're supposed to do a specific job. And you have over 200 different kinds of cells in your body. Now, the easiest thing to assume is that, okay, cells are different because they read different parts of that DNA. And that would actually be somewhat correct, right? Because as you can see down below, at any one time, human cells might be expressing only 20% of their genes. But if I just say that cells read different parts to do different functions, that can't be completely correct either. Because I'm supposed to have 200 different kinds of cells. And 20% only fits in 105 times. If all cells read completely different DNA, there could only be 5 different kinds of cells. So that's not accurate either, right? So again, two things that we need to kind of talk about, right? Yes, cells use different DNA to do different things, but most of what cells use, most of that 20% that we're talking about there, is actually overlap, right? So we got to talk about how they do use different DNA, but most is overlap. The easiest way to describe that is with an analogy. If your DNA was a book, if it was a science book, right, that science book would be composed of some kind of introduction, right? Just like every science class you've ever had, you talked about scientific method. You talked about the same things at the beginning, right? But then you start to specialize. Then you start to talk about specific topics that only have to do with biology, that only have to do with physical science, that in the future will only have to do with chemistry, right? And yeah, there's a little bit of overlap. There's some things that are connected together. But basically, every cell has this introductory section that's read, right, in their DNA. And it tells that cell a lot of the basic things that every cell needs to be able to do, right? So things like respiration, right? Those reactions that are happening in your mitochondria, right? All of your cells have to do that stuff because all of your cells need energy. So they need to read the parts of the DNA that help them do that. But otherwise, there are other chapters, so plus specific chapters, and different combinations thereof, will lead to specific functions that that cell has, right? So again, different kinds of cell. Let's say it's a muscle cell. Maybe it needs that intro section, right? But it needs chapters 7, 8, and 11 out of the muscle section, right? The muscle unit to be able to do all the other things that it needs to do, right? Whereas a brain cell would need that intro section, but then it would be in a completely different unit and be reading chapters 18, 19, 20, and 21, right? Again, you're reading different parts of this book, right? But most of it, what they read is the same, right? That intro is shared by all cells. And again, if I'm talking about DNA specifically, that may be like 15% of the DNA that all cells need to read. That all, I don't know what the real number is, but all cells have to do certain things, and they all need the directions for that. Whereas the specific chapters and different combinations of those chapters, that's where you come up with specific functions, right? These specific chapters, those specific other parts that are read, are where you're going to find your specific functions. So, moving on here, we got stem cells that we're going to talk about. Stem cells are a specific type of body cells that can develop into different types of cells. I'm not sure what our blank is here to deal with. I guess we need to talk about how they're undifferentiated. So unlike that other thing we were talking about on the last slide, cell differentiation, right? So these stem cells are just very basic. They don't have a specific function yet, but they can become specialized to do whatever you need them to do. So stem cells have to have these three different things. They have to be able to divide and renew themselves for a long period of time. They need to remain undifferentiated. Again, basically they're reading the intro section we talked about, but not doing anything else, right? Because if they were reading anything else, they'd be a specific kind of cell. And the trouble with cells is once they learn how to do something, they can't unlearn it. They can't do anything else. So they're going to remain undifferentiated. And that way they can develop into many different types of specialized cells, right? As long as they don't learn something, they can learn anything. They could become any kind of cell, essentially. So we're going to talk about different types of stem cells. There's classes, there's classes based on potential, but there are also classes based on where you find these cells in organisms. So I want to organize this information in kind of a graphic form. So let's get a blank page here so I can throw that in. So I want to kind of see on a continuum here, right? So I'm going to go from kind of left to right, from the least specialized to more specialized. So this side is less specialized. Towards more or completely specialized at this point eventually, right? And there were different classes. Again, the toady, pluri, multipotent. Those go across the top here. Toady, pluri, and multipotent, right? Totipotent stem cells are so unspecialized they can become anything. They could become a brain cell, they could become a skin cell, they could become a liver cell. It doesn't matter what it is, right? Those have the most potential to turn into whatever you want them to be, right? So they could be the most useful stem cells, right? Pluripotent can only turn into certain things, right? They're not totipotent, right? It's already specialized enough that it can't just become whatever it wants to be, but it still has quite a bit of potential left. Multipotent, on the other end, has the least potential. That kind of stem cell is probably already found in a certain type of tissue, so maybe like a muscle tissue. So that thing can't turn into anything but a muscle cell. Right? There are different kinds of muscle cells within the tissue that you're talking about, but it's already so specialized that it really can't leave the unit that it's in, right? Remember how I was talking about, like, maybe there's this unit for muscle cells that's chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever, right? Maybe they're not reading all those chapters, but specific chapters or combinations of those chapters make them a specific kind of muscle cell. But these multipotent ones have the least potential to become whatever kind of cell you want. So you can't use a multipotent stem cell that's found in a muscle tissue to replace a brain cell that was damaged, right? Because they're completely different kinds of cells. So anywhere from less on the left to more specialized on the right, understand as I'm going from left to right, I'm actually losing potential. The ones that were all the way on the right, let's see if we can do another line up here going from in this direction. These are the ones with the most potential, whereas these ones would have the least potential. Oops, kind of going crazy there. Potential. So again, like I was talking about before, it's, when we talk about the chapter analogy, right, the more a cell learns, the more specialized it gets, the less it's capable of doing otherwise, because anything they learn, they can't unlearn. That's the easiest way to think about it. It may not be a perfect analogy, but it's the best that I can come up with, right? The more specialized a cell is, the least potential, the less the potential that it would have, right? Whereas a cell with lots of potential would be very unspecialized. Origin, we got adult embryonic, right? So you probably heard of embryonic stem cells. Those are actually, so embryonic stem cells are pluripotent stem cells, and they're found in embryos, right? So embryos are very, very early stages of development for an organism. So that, for us, for a human, you're not even born yet, right? You're just starting to develop within the first couple weeks of that pregnancy, right? So an embryo is pluripotent, whereas adult stem cells are multipotent. Now, you got to be careful with that term. I actually prefer the term somatic because it means the same thing. Adult is misleading, right? Adult stem cells can be found in toddlers. Basically, if you're not an embryo, if you're past that stage of development, all stem cells are adult stem cells at that point, right? So I don't like that name because it's misleading. You, like, maybe depending on your culture and your definition, you might be thinking, oh, you have to be 19 years old before you can have adult stem cells. No, you have adult stem cells right now. In fact, that's all you have. You don't have any embryonic stem cells because you're not an embryo and you haven't been an embryo for like 15, 16 years. So I like that term somatic better because it's not as misleading. Somatic just means body, right? So any of those stem cells that you can find in your body now would be somatic, adult, multipotent stem cells. Whereas the embryonic stem cells, you've heard of those before because they're kind of controversial, right? It'd be cool to be able to use an embryonic stem cell to help fix somebody's spinal column so that they're not paralyzed anymore. But the moral ethical concern is you have to take embryonic stem cells from embryos, and embryos should be able to develop into their own person, human, right? Harvesting embryonic stem cells actually kills that embryo. So there's a moral ethical concern there, right? And there's a lot of different arguments to be had with that, and that's not necessarily what the purpose of talking about this is. But when you know or you learn that embryonic stem cell research is illegal in this country, it's illegal for a reason, right? That there are a lot of moral ethical concerns associated with, oh, is it okay to take these cells from a living organism and preventing it from becoming what it could be, right? Otherwise, totipotent, the only kind of cell that's totipotent in that context would be actually that original zygote. A zygote is an egg that's fertilized by a sperm cell, right? So that first cell that was you ultimately developed into all of the different cells you have, all 200 plus different kinds of cells. So that original cell obviously had the most potential. It was totipotent. But as soon as you're an embryo, you're already entering that pluripotent stage, right? So early development, when you just have this blob of cells, the outer and inner cells actually are in different conditions. The outer cells of this blob eventually develop into your skin, right? Things on the surface, right? Whereas those innermost cells turn into all those vital internal organs that you have. So there's development from like the first chance that there is, once there's multiple cells, some inside, some outside, that's when your cells start to specialize. But again, once you enter this multipotent, once you have those adult stem cells, which is anywhere past embryo, right? Once you can recognize that that is a human, then there are no embryonic stem cells left, right? So once you've had that sonogram where you can see fingers and toes, you don't have any embryonic stem cells left, right? So we have this range of stem cells. Again, all that information is in here, right? I just like to organize it in more of a graphical form. That way you can answer questions about it a little bit easier. You can find the information you need a little bit faster. So put that in your notes. Otherwise, all this stuff, stem cells provide opportunities for research, obviously. They could be used to treat many different kinds of cancer because, again, once you get rid of that tumor, you might need to repair that tissue, right? And stem cells would be good for that, right? They could provide cures for many diseases. It's possible maybe to fix things that don't work so that, you know, that person's body can now do the things it's supposed to be doing. Maybe you have diabetes. Maybe you have, right, you're diabetic. You can't make insulin because your pancreas cells aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Maybe I could put new cells into that pancreas that could develop and start functioning the way that they're supposed to and make that insulin that you need, right? Otherwise, mostly stem cells are controversial because the stem cells that would be the most useful are the ones that come from embryos, and that's a problem, obviously. We have actually found that some adult stem cells can be a little bit more flexible than we thought. Remember I said that once they learn something, they can't forget it? That's what we ultimately want to do. To be able to help someone, everyone has these adult stem cells, right? You can find somatic adult stem cells in anybody's body. If you could get those to backtrack on this continuum, if you could get those adult stem cells to start acting a little bit more like embryonic stem cells, then maybe you could fix somebody. Maybe you could help them with their own cells, and then it's not controversial anymore, right? So we're trying to back things up. We're trying to get cells to unlearn, unspecialize. So that's what most of the research is right now. Otherwise, we do have moral ethical concerns with using one organism. Killing one organism to help another one is not necessarily the answer. Otherwise, answering this question again, you're supposed to talk about, for the skin cells, heart cells, same DNA, how can they be different? You need to talk about how cells read different parts of their DNA. But there's also a lot of overlap. It's just those very specific differences that lead to specific functions, right? You can use the book analogy when you type this answer or when you write this answer in your notes. You can talk about how there's this intro section that all cells read, but specific chapters lead to specific functions, right? Again, when you talk about somatic stem cells, those adult ones, right? Once you start reading that muscle unit, you can't really be a brain cell anymore. So once they become specialized, it's kind of hard to unspecialize them. But they might have different combinations of chapters in said unit to make them function the way they're supposed to. Otherwise, the stem cells help treating injuries and diseases. That again would be talking about using stem cells to replace damage or cells that are not functioning the way that they're supposed to. So that's the hope, is that we could use them to help fix tissue, repair tissue, or replace non-functioning tissue. And hopefully we can someday use your own stem cells to do that.